All right, tan sene totem tik, jurida greyes did sigasun, maskego sagahigana kotsinia. Good morning or good afternoon. My name is Jurida Greyes. I'm the Acting Associate Vice President of Indigenous Affairs here at the University of Winnipeg. I would like to welcome you to the last Weweni lecture of the year. And I would just like to acknowledge this morning we started with a pipe ceremony and a smudge with Henry Skywalker and Sherry Copany, so I'd just like to acknowledge them. I'd also like to acknowledge today's presentation is a partnership between Nanandawe Wigamig, the First Nations Health and Social Secretariat of Manitoba. So I'd like to acknowledge the Kitik, the elders and knowledge keepers that they brought here today and their support of the event. So we have an exciting presentation today, a personal and professional partnership of Dr. Marie Battiste and Dr. Sákéj Youngblood Henderson are here today. We jokingly refer to them as the Jay-Z and Beyonce of the Indigenous Academy. So we're very lucky to have them here. So Dr. Marie Battiste is Mi'kmaq. She holds degrees from Harvard and Stanford, and she's currently a professor in the Department of Educational Foundations and the academic director of Aboriginal Education Research Center at the University of Saskatchewan. Dr. Sákéj Youngblood Henderson is Chickasaw from Oklahoma. He obtained a Juris Doctorate in law from the University of Harvard, from Harvard University, and is a research fellow at the University of Saskatchewan's Native Law Center of Canada. Please join me in welcoming to Treaty 1 territory and the heart of the Métis Nation, Dr. Marie Battiste and Dr. Sákéj Youngblood Henderson.
Kwei, medawalok diok. Awal dasi bejidayo misit wen. Ni delwisi Marie Battiste at lewi esasoni a Bodladek First Nation. Ningma. Well, dasi jik bejidayum sit wen. Enigma la genum quizicum. Teluisi Sákéj Henderson.
Chokma. Chickasaw say Sákéj Henderson. Madawa look the oak and bazul.
And this morning, I'm really pleased that we've had the opportunity to be welcomed well and to have had our tobacco offered to us for today, as well as to have had the opportunity to witness the pipe ceremony and to be part of the pipe ceremony and thank Elder Henry Skywalker for his morning with us. And I wanted to also say thank you to University of Winnipeg for bringing us here, and for all of you students who are here and taking your lunch break. I thank you for having some time with us. Sákéj and I usually do our own pony shows. And I said, because basically we are often called upon to travel and to talk on various topics, often him on law and constitution issues and mine on education. And it's not always that we have an opportunity to be together. And so it's an experience for both of us to put this thing together. And because it's not something that we have practiced, it's something that we've had to negotiate. So in part, we are performing a new dance, so to speak. So we'd like to start off with recognizing our protocols of place and recognize that we acknowledge that we are on Treaty 1 territory, the territory of Anishinaabe and of the homelands of the Métis. And interesting that, you know, one of the things that we also say is that it's not just, you know, a epithet that you say we acknowledge place, because it's very important that youth and students and the university understand why we do this. In part, we recognize the constitutional place of territory. We also acknowledge the shared stewards of the land and honor the relationship of Aboriginal nations in the territories with their guests. We also acknowledge and make visible that Aboriginal people have been silenced and invisible and marginalized, and yet they are the original owners and caretakers and stewards and prayer leaders over the land. And they who guide and help our ecology to grow. And so it's important that we prioritize with respect and reciprocity and relationship the constitutional priorities within indigenization. As well, we also recognize that place is, when we think about honoring place, we also recognize that place has an Indigenous knowledge. And that Indigenous knowledge is what we are all each born into. That in our place, we are born into a land, we are born into a language, we are born into a particular place that over the years has been subjected to a colonial experience on which another language, another knowledge system has been put on top of that. And it hasn't been one that has gone well. And in part, this morning we're going to be talking about that particular experience with that. What we are and who we are is what we know. And over the years, in terms of my own growing up, I've had to, my parents left well before I was born, and left the reserve in Bodladek First Nations, and they traveled to the States to do, like all of our people did at the time, the nomadic work in different places. But they remained there, and it was in that remaining in the States and throughout my growing up years that it was my father's intention that I get an education. Because at the time, there was no one in my family and my parents' immediate family who had gone on to get an education. And my father always said to me that I was special. And when you're told by by a parent that you're special, you believe it in your heart. And I felt that I was special, and he thought I was special because I was born in the United States. And because of that, he knew that I had an inheritance that came with that, but he didn't know what that would be. And eventually, it would take me through the systems of education in Maine, and then on to Harvard University, and then later Stanford University, all under various kinds of fellowships and grants. And it was there that I met my husband at the Harvard Law School. He was my tutor in public school law. And so it's been a delightful, 40, we just celebrated our 42 years together.
The challenges of place has been very crucial to the Canadian consciousness, and it mainly focuses on is that the Indigenous place was inconsistent and incongruous to the imported knowledge systems they carried and the languages. And at first they started to talk about what we called civilization as Aboriginal people. They started calling it the wilderness. It was wild. It wasn't like their homelands. It wasn't towns and cities. It was natural ecologies and natural abundance and natural things without any shops, without any stores, without much trading or anything going on from their point of view. And this creates the problem of Canada still, and it haunts us today, is that it created how do you define and how do you find the new? It sets up the problem of being exiled from homelands, a biblical tale, but also a modern tale of many people being moved from their homelands. But it sets up the physical, the cognitive, and emotional confrontations and the alienated discontinuity between the English and French languages and the new land, and it generates the theme of wilderness, uncontrolled environment, and a disrespect for the environment. And it sets up a relationship with the Aboriginal peoples, which generates into a formulation of a racial and oppressive politics and law. And underneath this is a continuous view of cognitive anxiety and now the new concept of identity. The challenge of the Indigenous place to the colonial minds created and reflected what I'd call a cognitive terror of transplanted knowledge systems trying to understand something that is not understandable. And it generates this pervasive anxiety about the search for cognitive authenticity. How can you be authentic when you're in someone else's land, another language system that's describing all the land that you can't speak? And this has become the permanent feature of Canadian literature and social science thought, and now it's reflected in the issue of people saying, what is the identity of Canada, and how is it different from Europe, and how is it different from the Indigenous people? And it also sets up the personality crisis of identity of the settlers. All of this was resolved, or attempted to be resolved, by formal compulsory education systems, which taught about the distant homelands that other people were from, and taught in those languages, and totally subverted and made hidden or invisible the Indigenous view of the land, the view of the knowledge system, and the view of the languages.
And one of the things that, as I grew up in the United States and began going through the educational system, my parents always kept the language within our home, talking to us, but I had no one to really to talk to in Mi'kmaq, and so gradually I became much more versed in speaking English. And it wasn't until I went back to the reserve and we started to raise our children that we began to learn back again our language, in my community, Mi'kmaq. But one of the things that, that education has done for us, it has created a whole layering of education within a Eurocentric system. And the thing is that all of us, no matter where we come from, and those even our elders who are here, have been immersed in our Eurocentric system, a system in which we have been thrust. It is Eurocentrism is not just an attitude, it's not just an ideology, it's multiple layers of systems, knowledge that is embedded within a knowledge system. It is what is at, not only in the educational institutions, it's in law, it is in politics, it's in the journals that we have to write in, it's in all the magazines, it's everything that we touch in terms of print. And so Eurocentrism is something that we have been totally marinated in, and as we become aware of another knowledge systems that we have lost or been eroded or changed by the presence of Eurocentric education and the Indian residential schools, we become aware how important it is for us to deconstruct and understand that particular kind of knowledge system. Part of what the job is, and part of our work as Indigenous scholars, as Indigenous students who are working our way through the system, and now with the Indigenization being part of the university for all students, it's a kind of it's striking us as an important place on which we begin to look at that unqualified assimilation policy that has been driven so far and wide. Everyone must understand where it comes from, as well as how it has affected us. We need to understand that becoming into a organic Indigenous intellectual means that we become immersed back into some systems or within a knowledges of our own people. And part of that, for some of us, like when I did my dissertation, I looked at my own people and my own history and the ways in which education flowed by looking at the orthography systems that created literacy. So mine was looking at the historical analysis of literacy and literacy diffusion within my people to understand how we need to move out from under it. So as part of the other phase in which we need to be working toward is that it works on to enlighten others. So the kind of work that many of our Indigenous scholars, and I met with Beryl this morning, whose work is to helping our Indigenous people get our terminal degrees and share that knowledge widely in all kinds of places, as well as to recognize the issues of intellectual property that are both appropriating our knowledges for things that we are not wanting it to be appropriated for, as well as finding ways in which we can share knowledge that can be open to all Indigenous people. Part of also our decolonizing awareness is that none of us have a place where we can go to that is what you might call a decolonizing education. That we have been both the victim and the beneficiary of a Eurocentric education, both that has victimized the peoples by removing their knowledge systems and replacing it with Eurocentric knowledge systems and languages, but also to recognize that in order for us to move forward, we have to be critically conscious of what has happened, and that we become the critical learners herewith in terms of making the change and beginning to work on decolonization ourselves.
The root of all the problem is this paradox of newness. And if you look at Canadians' history, you start off with Newfoundland, then you go to New Scotland, and then you go to New Brunswick. And finally, you start entering in Ontario a consciousness of Aboriginal identity of Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and it leaves in Alberta and goes to British Columbia. But that's sort of a history of being new. But why was it new? And why was it new is the most important part of this paradigm shift of knowledge from the old biblical knowledge to the modern knowledge. That before, they say, Columbus discovered the New World, that the map of Europe and Asia, which is a contested map, and Africa were the only continents. Now, let's be clear that Europe was never a continent. It's taught as if it was, but it never was. It's part of Asia. Most people call it Western because it's Western Asia, not Eastern Asia or the Orient. But it's the same continent. And so there's really only two continents, Africa and Asia, or Eurasia, or how you want to say it. But the problem is that all comes from biblical knowledge, and that when they discovered the New World, the big, dominant intellectual question of religion and scholarship was, why did God not tell the Europeans about North and South America or Australia or any of the other islands? How come God gave them partial knowledge, not complete universal knowledge? And that creates a huge transformation, because not only the land, but the people were unexplained. And so you get the allegory of the knowledge systems, and Americus Vespucci's letter in 1503 sort of is an intellectual attempt to explain why it's lawful to call it a new world, and that's because none of these countries were known to our ancestors, and that all who hear about them, they find them will be entirely new. But they have found a continent in the southern part, which is South America, full of animals and more populous than Europe, Asia, or Africa. This change of the knowledge system created two big debates that we have not really resolved, and we've been attempting to do it for a long time. And the first is, what are the nature of the inhabitants? There's an endless religious debate about whether they're beasts or animals, natural slaves, or humans or persons. And this goes from 1491 to the present, that we finally resolved in Canada that originally, when Canada was formed, the interpretive code said that persons refers to everyone but an Indian person. And so that was changed about 1950 by taking that interpretive phrase out of the federal law. But still, when we traveled anywhere else, we were still considered non-persons. And we found that out during the constitutional debates. And so we went on a long 30-year journey in the United Nations to have them say that we were humans or persons entitled to human rights and human laws. So this isn't an old argument. It comes up in many manifestations. Nowadays, it comes up with the issue of what kind of citizens of Canada are we, or what is our status? But this is all trying to figure out this newness of the people who weren't from Europe or Asia. Now, this also introduces a whole different Indigenous knowledge system that Indigenous people had that was recognized and then hidden through the curriculum. But the incomplete biblical knowledge system and traditions created a cognitive dissonance or confusion among European scholars in the priesthood. And this created several things that are very important. First is the Protestant Reformation. Because of the partial knowledge and the lack of what God told the people who wrote the Bible, the Protestant Reformation built on that cleavage to say they have a better understanding of what God wants. And then it moved into the European Enlightenment. Then it moved into the Westphalian Treaty Order about 1640, which eventually comes to America with the Treaty Order. But it really creates what we're struggling with and against at the same time, the split-head approach of almost every Aboriginal person of being educated in a Eurocentric or Western knowledge tradition, but still having an Indigenous language or knowledge system that's fighting and conflicting with us as we go through the process. So that's the challenge of newness, and it continues on. And there's two Eurocentric responses to the newness. In South America, they had to defeat and conquest the Aboriginal languages and nations through military force. But in North America, the response was to create a treaty order of Aboriginal nations. And that's a totally different order than a conquest order. And many times people think Native people here were conquested because of this tradition in the literature, which is a false tradition, that they don't understand there's many traditions.
And so part of what happens is that as we get into the treaty order and we begin to work through treaties, in the Victorian treaties is where in the East and moving to the numbered treaties into the West, one Ojibwe chief was said to, during his negotiations, to say, "Our hands are poor, but our heads are rich. And it's the riches that we ask so that we may be able to support our families as long as the sun rises and the water runs." And so when we think about education today, and we think about the kinds of things that our ancestors put forward for us in terms of what was the aspirations for us, it is that we have both educational systems. The Ojibwe chiefs, or in Treaty 1, the textual promise of the treaty to education is, "And further, Her Majesty agrees to maintain a school on each reserve, hereby made whenever the Indians of the reserve should desire it." So there wasn't a compulsion. It was that we had a right to decide when we wanted it, and then and how we also wanted it. So when we look at in the court case of Grassy Narrows, First Nations in 2015, the court said that both the federal and provincial governments are responsible for implementing the treaties in accordance with the decision of the power in the Constitution. And yet, what we have found over time is that the whole issues of treaties have been put into a framework of lies and other kinds of omissions and marginalizations of the Indigenous people around the world, in order that the Eurocentrism continues to hold on to the reassuring lie that indeed there is no treaties, there are no Indigenous people, and basically Eurocentrism and European settlement can continue on. When we think about Thomas King's book, The Inconvenient Truth, I found this wonderful little cartoon to that, is that it's been a reassuring lie for many, and that now we are disrupting that as we move forward.
The framework of the assuring lie is really the generation of colonial blame frames in Eurocentrism that relate to Aboriginal people. Now, these were all created after the treaty order, but the colonial administrations had to justify their non-compliance with the treaty to the king and the queen. In doing that, they developed these blame frames, which really create a perception of justice that hides the injustice, the disloyalty to the treaties that were going on. And while now most of these blame frames operate subconsciously, they are still the secret palliative of the Eurocentric thought. It's a coping mechanisms for people who are faced with cognitive injustices, that humans have this innate ability not to want injustice and want to be perceived as just and fair and nice. But when all the situations are saying they aren't that, they develop these blame frames. And these blame frames are set up really to blame the Aboriginal people, which would become the victims of the colonization experience. And they're also preconceiving the colonial bystander or the beneficiaries as innocent, that they're excused as non-victims in the process of colonization, that someone else is doing it, it's not them. But the basic blame frames all argue for the one thing educational theory has always relied on, is that these people have to be assimilated, to be someone that they weren't meant to be someone else dreams up, not the spirit that was created within them. These institutional blame frames, I have 6 that are very popular. The first one, the God frame, is that it justifies any unjust outcomes toward Aboriginal people because of the presence or absence of God's grace, will, or plan, that they weren't Christians, they didn't know about the Bible, that's such. And on the other hand, they were sometimes menacingly described as demonic forces. But that's the God frame. The next one is the nature frame, and that says all the unjust outcomes in Canadians' creation is dictated not only by the divine, but also by this state of nature developed by British thinkers Hobbes and Locke about a certain skin color, race, or inherited quality or genes, and now it's moving into biological or genetic blame frame, saying that there's something wrong with our genetic framework. The other is the traditional value framework, which reflects that Aboriginal people deviate and are not consistent with Eurocentric thought or Western thought, so therefore they're inferior, and their thoughts don't compare to the golden age of Greece or the golden age of the Enlightenment. Sort of a more newer concept is the normalcy frame, and that reflects the extent to which individuals or group have a normal or a diseased deviant character. Now, the idea of character is really questionable, but it's still the one they use. And most of them will say that the Aboriginal people are a deviant kind of people for X number of reasons. One of the most important modern reasons, as they try and move away from the racial frame without confronting all of the racial frame, you move into the cultural frame, which reflects that the merits of Aboriginal people's presumed basic shared disposition is their problem, that culture is their problem, their parents are their problems, the culture that they've inherited from their ancestors is the problem that justifies all the inequalities and equalities. And the new one that's just emerged mostly through economic thought is now the choice frame. And that justifies all the unjust outcomes for Aboriginal people because of the choices of individuals or the groups which they reflect. So these are all blame frames that create the norms of Eurocentrism as applied to Aboriginal people.
And of course, James Blount is one of our favorite writers. He's a geographer, and when he looked at Europe and analyzed it, he was pointing to various characteristics of Eurocentrism in this Eurocentric worldview. And part of that is that, you know, the land that they arrived to as settlers is ostensibly empty. considering the millions and millions of people that were here and were living here and leaving their mark on the land, it is interesting that they could bring that kind of myth of emptiness on which their doctrine of discovery is premised. And so they arrive into this empty land, and then they then begin to settle it. They use the land and till it. So what happens is that they're building on a premise that Aboriginal people are empty of intellectual creativity, spiritual values, and rationality. One of the ones of the writing that for Mi'kmaq was Christian Leclerc, who arrived here sometime in the late 1500s, and lives among Mi'kmaq people, but in which he then talks about how they are very rich with all kinds of things, but yet he wants to lay out a empty framework because they are not European. The Europeans also take note of all the wealth, and part of that material wealth is then diffused, taking up the resources of the land and diffusing it to the homeland, and meanwhile calling those people with whom they have taken that resources from as uncivilized, and that we are continuing to having to find ways to deal with that kind of mythical beginnings of our peoples in education.
One of the writers, Albert Memmi, reveals the strategy of colonialism and racism that's central to Eurocentric thought about all peoples that aren't European. And he has just a 4-stage process, which we like a lot because it applies around the world, and it's stressing the real or imaginary differences between the colonizer or the racist and the Aboriginal victim. It's assigning values to these differences to the advantages of the colonizer or the racist, trying to make the values absolute between the two groups by generalization of them and claiming that they are final at the victim's expense. And in order to justify the accuser's own privileges and aggression, these strategies work to create racism and colonialism in Eurocentric thought.
In my classes, I teach on anti-racist education at the University of Saskatchewan. These particular elements of understanding how racism works and what is a strategy that creates the justification of what has been seen as white superiority, white privilege, because oftentimes people think that that is inherent, that was inherited, that is something that comes with progress, that comes with all the things of their goodness and innocence. But what they don't understand and what they have not come to grips with, many of our students today in the universities across Canada, as well as in our peoples in Canada at large, is to understand how racism is perpetuated by the very foundations and assumptions that have been carried over from those earlier years. So what I've talked about and a lot of my work has built around cognitive imperialism. And cognitive imperialism is the kind of like when you become Eurocentric educated, and all of the kinds of knowledge systems and languages that belong to your elders and so on, that kind of whitewashing of the mind is what cognitive imperialism implies. It also defines success for Indigenous people as being those who assimilate to dominant norms. Oftentimes, I'm always they say, "You're so successful." And I say, well, I'm successful because I sound like them. You know, my success because I went to, Harvard and Stanford. Is my success? While I think that has a measure of success, it is not the success that I ultimately want. It's how can I balance a knowledge system and language systems in the same way as I have this in English, I should also have that in Mi'kmaq and also in other languages that are in my territory. So we are always being put up as how our success is garnered. If we have a job, if we speak English, if we look a particular way, if we're, even more successful is if your color of your skin is a little bit lighter than others. So one of the things that, I always say to people is that we have no conventional place on which to, or form a place from which we can develop our Indigenous knowledges. Only through our elders, only through our communities, only through the language that are being held, and only through our beginning to build a foundation for making that possible. And as we begin to look at issues of where do we go from here, I have to remind people that we are not wanting to just have a job in BP at U of Winnipeg or in the potash company. That a job in those places is not success. That our successes are going to be constantly measured against the ability of our Indigenous nations and languages and cultures and communities and teachings and ceremonies and traditions to be at the same level as all other of these particular places.
The big question that was a breakthrough for myself and many people in boarding school was when a good friend of mine, Clyde Warrior, asked the question of what grants these Eurocentric teachers the privilege or right to intervene in our minds and our traditions, whereby colonizing it. That it was assumed that because they were teachers, they were doing the right things in boarding schools. But he raised the question, and we couldn't answer it, that what gave them that right? We respected them as teachers to a certain extent, but they weren't teachers in our traditions. They weren't teachers of the summertime. They were teacher of the fall and the winter and the spring, but they weren't the teachers of the summertime. And so we started challenging that issue, and the only thing that our teachers could say is, well, the government makes it compulsory for you to be here, which wasn't a real answer, it was a power relationship. But it was really their belief that Eurocentrism was the only universal knowledge system in the world, and that for us to get ahead, we had to learn that. And we kept saying, well, what does get ahead mean? That we have all these black people in the South who are protesting because they speak English, they're educated in the Eurocentric system, but you won't let them drink or live or eat in the same places as you. So why do we want to be part of you that oppress the black people if that's our ultimate goal? And so that was the big question. But their only answer was the myth that there is only one knowledge system in the world that's valid. It has all the truth. It's universal. It's applied everywhere. And that this will give you the ability to cope and make a living and become successful.
And so one of our elders, G. Captain Alec Denny, often would say to us, you can't be the doctor if you're the disease. And so what he was meaning was that, if we assume that First Nations education is a problem of the students, it establishes the inferiority paradigm. If we assume that the method or what one does is the problem, then it perpetuates the othering of and the subordination of First Nations within a superiority paradigm. Education cannot be the doctor of the disease. There's many places through which we need to interrogate education, not just in terms of the theories that they are utilizing, not just the methods that they're using, but the whole underlying structures we need to be moving and examining. In the work that I do, and decolonization is probably one of the, among the things that I'm well known for having done some work in. I wrote this book in 2013 following up on some of the work that I'd done on decolonizing education, nourishing the learning spirit. And that it is a way in which I have brought to bear some of my experiences in education, as well as bringing together the histories of the work that I've done in terms of doing my own studies, and also looking at the ways in which we can nourish the learning spirit, but not just not just our Indigenous young people, not just the students as they go through school, but we need to nourish everyone's learning spirit. But in so doing, we need to be truthful. We need to be absolutely bring our education now to the universities. But we have to be aware that the master's tools, said Audre Lorde, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. It's held up so well that we need to rethink what those particular tools are. In the tools of this trade, it is getting an education, doing the research, getting a job in the institution, following through with the various structures of tenure, promotion and renewal and so on. But all of those contain various Eurocentric structures that we are constantly having to unpack and dissolve, as well as to remake. There's a two-pronged process I talk about in my book about doing the work we do, and part of that is in terms of deconstruction. We need to unpack, undo, redo the legs on the chair, but we also need to reconstruct it. And it might be that we need to reconstruct it in ways that, first of all, stem from our own teachings, from our elders, from our communities, from within the languages that we have, many of us have not been able to keep and hold on to. So it's with wonder that I often see so many young people, you know, who are even young ones who are having a chance to have their education. Our children, my grandson now is in immersion school in Mi'kmaq territory. He's in the first Mi'kmaq school that has been created by the Mi'kmaq Ganambarimkawe, which is an educational authority that is moving kids through First Nations education at a rate much greater in the 80, 90, and 100% levels as compared to the level that is at present somewhere around 45 to 58% in Canada. We still have more kids out of school by virtue of from 1 in 6 students are still not accounted for in the educational systems. So deconstruction for me is a really important place for which we begin to develop the awareness and the critique of Eurocentrism, colonial bias, and also the racialized negative discourses, values, and the effects on everyone. And we only need to witness was it a couple of months ago when CBC News took out their blog dealing with Aboriginal content because there was so much negativity that was being brought up onto the blog. So there is, and continues across Canada, the negative discourses about Aboriginal people and about Aboriginal issues, treaties, and so on. It was Thomas King, who's in the Inconvenient Indian, who talks about the Indian who is the romanced Indian that everyone loved. The second one was, I've forgotten.
The Indian that vanishes?
Yeah, the vanishing Indian that everyone romanced about. And then the third one was the legal Indian that everyone hates. So it is that, you know, when we look at those different kinds of structures, we still continue to see those emanating throughout. And so deconstruction for me is an important place, especially for looking at racism and anti-racism, whiteness and privilege that continue throughout our systems.
One of the major ways we've tried to decolonize, because education is such a hard jelly-like system to try and change, is that as the first generation of the Eurocentric educated Aboriginal lawyers, we decided that we had to change the Constitution of Canada to reflect the more ancient Aboriginal and treaty rights of Aboriginal peoples of Canada. And we created in that a whole new concept of a place of power called Aboriginal Peoples of Canada. And they have their Aboriginal and treaty rights. And these Aboriginal and treaty rights are related to everyone, that everyone starts out with Aboriginal rights. Some have made some concessions and delegations to the Crown through treaties, but those were all supplementary to the Aboriginal knowledge traditions. The treaties were supplemental. They weren't grants from the king or queen to the Aboriginal people. That we already had a knowledge system, we already had a language system, we already had schooling, we had already had these things. But the treaties just empowered the Crown more than it empowered us. That's not the way they were always written, but that was the truth, and that's what the court acknowledges. But the reason that it is important is because all the federal and provincial laws, all the education laws, all the laws have to be consistent with Aboriginal and treaty rights to be valid in Canada. To the extent that they're inconsistent with our treaty rights or our Aboriginal rights, then they're invalid. And that applies to all the rights of the Canadians and the Canadian inhabitants in the Charter rights, which is new to them in 1982. That all their rights, their individual rights under the Charter cannot be constructed to abrogate or derogate from the Aboriginal or treaty rights. So these Aboriginal rights are part of the supreme law of the nation. One of the problems I alluded to earlier was that we weren't seen as persons internationally, so we had to move from constitutional reform to the UN human rights covenants, and said the human rights covenants applied to us. And it took us 30 years to get the UN to agree to that all the human rights covenants that apply to humans also apply to Aboriginal people. It's a shame that we had to do that, but it shows you the resistance of Eurocentric thought to us being a person that have inherent rights. And all that was based on self-determination. And the list of these rights are long, but they all tell in a short story that we have a right to our culture, our knowledge systems, our sciences, our humanities, and those rights can't be taken away by any other people in the world or taken away by any governments. Now, one of the big problems is that in Canada, since most people in Canada have lived under a single sovereignty, the Crown, that all laws have to come from the Crown. And so the idea of inherent rights, which is as old as Aboriginal thoughts, aren't understood. So people say, well, we have to pass these Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples into law. And we say to them, no, these belong to us as humans. They don't belong to governments. Governments can't counteract them. They can't abrogate them. They can't deny them. Why would we want to give them the power to tell us what we've already been told? And that's the big debate we have. This debate was continued in the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, and its conclusions are as valid today as it was in 1996. And the fundamental premise is that Canada as a country cannot be built on a living lie. And that's the lie of colonialism, that's the lie of the master narrative of the two founding races, that's the ignoring of Aboriginal people were here. And they've said that the major policy direction of the Indian Act, pursued for more than 150 years, first by the colonial, now by the Canadian governments, and still by the Canadian government, has been wrong. And the assimilation policy has done great damage, leaving a legacy of brokenness among Aboriginal peoples. This legacy of brokenness has been further explained by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission as a product of the Indian residential school as effect on both Indians and Métis. And the conclusion of the Royal Commission was that the Indians' only offense to Canada was their wish to continue living in their own communities and evolve in accordance to their own traditions, laws, knowledge systems, and aspirations. That's the only thing Indians did wrong, was deny that they wanted to be assimilated.
And so one of the things that, as we arrive into the contemporary era, where the issue for what has been emerging, since 1972 with the Indian control of Indian education, has been a growing emergence of the Renaissance of Indigenous peoples. And this emerging Renaissance has been both coupled in time with a lot of work that has been also done in post-colonial critique. Post-colonialism is grounded within a Eurocentric knowledge tradition, but it is the critique of that knowledge tradition, and that has begun well before the women feminist movements. It has been part of that. It's been part of the ethnic groups talking about their systems of knowledge and the ways in which that has not been brought into the Eurocentric knowledge systems. It has been a critique of the post-colonial, postmodern, but that has been a very important place for many of us as Indigenous scholars to draw upon that particular critique, because then we can also build on our critique. And our critique is not necessarily a post-colonial critique. Our critique is different. And our critique is both one of trying to get cognitive justice through our educational system, balancing knowledge systems. It is to bring to bear on the constitutional imperative, the 1982, the emergence of our Aboriginal and treaty rights being accepted and framed within the Constitution in Canada, which I often say Canada doesn't become Canada until it has the treaties. And so that also with that has been the fact that the courts have worked in our favor in many of the cases that have been brought forward in terms of Indigenous knowledges, and that the court in R.V. Cote in 1996 said that where there is an Aboriginal right, there is a corresponding right to teach that. So we do have enough, what I would call ammunition or justification for the emergence and the carrying out of our Indigenous knowledge traditions throughout our education. We also are talking about reconciling the Constitution. One of the things that even after 1982, when the Constitution was brought forward and the affirmation of Aboriginal treaty rights, all the legislation across the province should have begun to make a reconciliation with that Constitution. That never did happen. And so what we need to do is continue to look at the ways in which within provincial territorial legislation, how they are actually aligning themselves with the constitutional reconciliation with Aboriginal treaty rights. And now with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, we're 20 years past RCAP, and we are at a place where we should be bringing forward Indigenous knowledge that's intimately connected to place, that is part of all of our language and traditions and ceremonies. It does have specific linguistic categories, rules, and relationships and knowledge, has localized content, but most importantly, it has various protocols for how it is to be accessed. And so we need to be aware that our Indigenous knowledge has within our own teachings ways of having it protected, as well as ways in which it is protected within the people, within the language, but also that the people know what parts of it should be pushed out into different places, what other parts are held and held within families, within clans, within individuals, and in groups. So it's a matter of our peoples need to be part of that conversation in order to achieve that.
One of the most important things that we're talking about now is how to do this, and this is through a method of a trans-systemic synthesis. Now, Eurocentric knowledge is undergoing a huge shift today with people trying to move away from the older disciplinaries to interdisciplinary, to transdisciplinary, to cross-cultural studies and all that. But all of that operates within the Eurocentric framework, and that's no good for us, not in total. It's an interesting supplement, but it isn't the core of teachings that our students need and our societies need to revitalize itself. So when we talk about trans-systemic synthesis, we're talking about how do you synthesize Aboriginal knowledge with Eurocentric knowledge at a systemic level. No one's developed this path. Indigenous scholars all over the world are doing it. Some people, like at the University of South Africa, are doing it much better than we are. Some people, like in Maori, are doing it a little bit better than we are. But none of them have found, how do you braid together Indigenous knowledge and Eurocentric knowledge in a respectful, dignified way that recognizes each one of them are different knowledge traditions, but there's something that they can all agree to. And how do you find that consensus? That's one of the major problems we have. Our elders have taught us from the seventh fire prophecy on to Peter Cochise' The Double Understandings, Micmac elder Albert Marshall on the two-sided seeing through the Eurocentric way and seeing through the Aboriginal way, and putting it together as a 3D picture. These are all attempts to figure out how to braid the knowledge systems together to be productive for our students in the future. It's not a repudiation of Eurocentric knowledge, as you may infer. It's a knowledge system we respect, but it has limitations for us. It's not ours. And it talks about other people's struggle for justice and freedom. But Indigenous knowledge is what we are. That's why we were born Indians. That's why we're created to these families. That's why we have elders, and that's why we have knowledge, traditions, and language that explain things to us, and we have to know both. In my society in Oklahoma, we're called the split-head generation because we've been the first to master both sides of the mind, the Indigenous mind and the European mind. We haven't done it perfectly, and I don't want anyone to think we have. We know they exist, we know they have to be blended, but that's what trans-systemic analysis is going to require, and that's what the universities have to do in collaboration with elders and knowledge holders. We prefer to call them the College of Elders. We like the idea that they're a separate college. They're an Indigenous college, and they should have the same respect as professors in the Eurocentric tradition, even though they may not have the same roles or duties. That universities have to respect our elders by allowing the elders to form their College of Elders and choosing who should speak where and about what topics.
And so one of the things as we look at what is going on right now, there's a great deal of activity around our both indigenization across Canada. It's partly in reflecting of the work of in the provinces and in Canadian Council of Ministers of Education, putting priorities on Aboriginal education. And so there's a great deal of effort ongoing, and that work is partly taken up by the Canadian Deans of Education, who have included Indigenous knowledges within their accord in 2010. We have the Truth and Reconciliation Calls to Action. We have treaty curricula now in some provinces of Manitoba, Saskatchewan, now Nova Scotia. We have Universities Canada, their 13-point plan came out in the same year that the TRC Calls to Action came out. And we have the Association of Community Colleges across Canada having Indigenous protocols. So there's many of different kinds of things that are ongoing. And this whole reconciliation, in part, in my view, has to be towards self-determination. The critique I have of the University of Canada is that it takes people through, it brings them in, gives them number, gets them through, counts them as a success as they move through, and if they get a job at BP or Potash or some other, even at the university, they are called success. Rather than looking at how do we build successful capacity within our own Indigenous nations. One of the building blocks of that, in my view, is the WINHEC, the World Indigenous Nations Higher Education Consortium. And that consortium is a way in which Indigenous people have built their own certification requirements for indigenization, Indigenous programming, and to which they bring it from the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as one of their principal ways of doing it. So we do certification within the university by having a process within. What we need to do is begin to work on finding the ways in which we can make it a self-determining process, one that will take us through the final part of what David Bernard is talking about, and in that he says, when understanding of First Nations, Métis, and other Indigenous culture is woven throughout all of the campuses, then real change will occur. And with that, I want to say thank you very much for your rapt attention today.
I think I have a lot of reading to do over the summer. You know, it's always a pleasure to hear from such esteemed scholars as Sákéj and Marie. It's we're very honored and lucky to have them. And just to offer some closing comments, I would like to invite Dr. Annette Trimby up.
Thank you. So I want to thank our speakers, Dr. Battiste and Dr. Henderson. You did well together. I think you can do that more often. So it was very coherent and very well received. So I want to acknowledge that we do have a number of elders, and Elder Henry Skywater, not Skywalker, I think, and Elder Harry Bone, I recognize you, and I think Elder Dave Kershane, yeah, you're sitting there quietly. And I would like to acknowledge we have a number of students and a number of professors in the room. So I don't know about the rest of you, but as I get older, I'm a more visual learner. So I found myself, you gave me a few outs, and I was imagining my teachers of the summer, my grandparents, and enjoying that. And I was thinking about the need to braid together Indigenous and non-Indigenous, and I was imagining myself in my grade 3 classroom. I was a little crackerjack of a child, and we were learning about First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people, and we had this giant piece of paper against the wall with chalk, and we could braid. And I was really wanting to learn a lot more about my city, my people, and that was probably it for my K-12 experience. Split head generation, that sounds a little bit hard. I feel like I have a split head, not a splitting headache, but I do find this room is a phenomenal place. We have very interesting conversations here, sometimes comfortable, sometimes not so comfortable. But I'm sure everybody in the room is trying to make sense of what they just heard from all of you. And I would like to encourage people to stick around. I think you'll be here for a little while. And maybe before I absolutely close it off, Jarita, we didn't give anybody a chance for Q&As. And everybody's still sitting here. So, who would like to ask a question? I remember you, Cornell West. You love that. Yeah.
You probably don't want to hear from me. Here's the uncomfortable ones. So it's interesting that you brought up David Barnard saying that, because there was a point where I whistle blew at in the public interest at the University of Manitoba, and it was basically to say that we need to change the structure of how our universities run, because there was too much abuse of power, the way the hierarchical model is. And I said that we should have it rotational self-managed teams, which is almost like the optimal Indigenous communities were. So I guess that's part of it, is to weave it, is to look at how we don't hurt and how we do hurt, and eliminate the things that hurt and keep the things that don't. I don't know if that makes sense. Sorry.
Well, that makes sense to me, but administration is all about hurt. That spirit always fights whatever structure you try and put forward. And you have to acknowledge that spirit will fight structure and want it to change, and some administrations change, and that, as we've said, that if we're going to change, we have to change with weaving both Indigenous knowledge and Eurocentric knowledge, because we don't feel that Eurocentric knowledge has achieved what it could if it understood itself from an Aboriginal perspective.
Sadie.
Hi, my name's Sadie. My question is, you kind of talked a little bit about cognitive dissonance, and what are some, I guess, ways of when you're teaching, when you're dealing with cognitive dissonance to either students or professors or people within the administration, and how to kind of ease them out of that, to kind of give them that little, enlightenment of that base mutual understanding and that move in education.
Yeah, I think that one of the ways I do that is, one is to recognize that Eurocentrism isn't belonging to white people. I say there's a lot of Indigenous people who are Eurocentric. But it is because of the ways in which we've been taught and led to believe that that is a superior way of doing things. So when we approached cognitive dissonance, it's a place where one knowledge system and another knowledge system interact and come to a place where we have to then unpack the assumptions behind what it is that brings us to that place. I always ask my people to say, whenever they write a saying, my mind was opened, or that was an aha moment, or whatever, stop and ask yourself, what did I believe before that? What was it that opened my eyes to something? In other words, my assumptions have changed as a result of that. So then we begin to trace those assumptions, and we begin to realize where some of those things are lodged in. And then we can bring in another one and respect that there are other knowledge systems, and that it doesn't mean that one is up against the other in terms of attitude, but rather where they come from. And some people might be just comfortable staying in the knowledge system they're in, but they have to at least know that there are other knowledge systems and that they don't come from the same source or have the same origins of assumptions and values to them. So it's a matter of bringing intellectual discussion to that. Thank you.
Anyone else? Kevin.
Bonjour. My name is Kevin Satie, and one of the things that really struck me was the cognitive imperialism, and the idea that the rigor of university can change the way you think, the way you are, the way you be. So in terms of challenging that, one of the things that I often think about is, the role of ceremonies and practices within universities. So my question is, what do you think the role is of universities in supporting cultural practices, ceremonies, as a way of challenging that cognitive imperialism?
Right. Well, there's a way in which I think that those could be used in two ways. One, not a good way, and in the other one is in a way in which it takes people and it makes them think they're getting appeased while they're being colonized. And so they bring in a few of this and a few of that, and everyone feels good. You got a powwow, and you got some ceremonies, and we start off the day, and so on. But if we don't really have a cognitive shift to talk about what is it Indigenous knowledge brings to us and why it is important we have it, then it can be then a source of helping to, as opposed to the residential schools where they beat you into colonization, they appease you through a colonization. In other words, just giving you the flavor of the month kind of thing. That's not what we want. We want an education system that is balanced in knowledge and understanding of where knowledge systems come from, why one has had the day in terms of being the predominance of our educational structures, and the other that has not gone through that structure in the same way, that is learned in a different way, has a different source, and so on. We need to find ways to bring these together. But that is not to create Indigenous knowledge like a Native Studies class, because a lot of Native Studies classes and Native Studies grew from within a Eurocentric structure and the same kinds of ways in which it was largely, in the early days, they were non-Indigenous writers who did the textbooks for Native studies. Today, we have more and more who are Indigenous authors to Native studies, but yet we still follow those same structures. So we are not talking about a Native study structure of Indigenous knowledge. I think that we have to be clear what we're going to do with that. But I think it's also important that our elders have our backs in terms of how to do that we might not be the ones to say this is the way it's done, but they need to be the ones that are engaged in that process and also brought in as faculty under faculty collective agreements. I'm part of the Canadian Association for University Teachers. I'm on the executive for that. And we are taking it up at the collective agreement level, looking at the ways in which faculty are our Indigenous elders and how that might be achieved. It has been done at Trent University. They have done it very well. And so there's precedence to that. And we now have a collective agreement at Laurentian University. I was going to say Lakehead, but they have something else at Lakehead. But at Laurentian, that they have the collective agreement that includes Indigenous knowledge.
Anyone
So
else?
in April, if any of you are in faculty association, we'll be taking it up at COUT.
Thank you. My name is Gabriel de Moga. I am coming from the south, where the Europeans basically went to conquest. Nevertheless, we still are there. I want to share one question because I see the tension when we try to indigenize, when we try to bring knowledge system into the academy. One of the constant questions is whether or not these structures, not the governance structure, but the physical, the places, the localities, could be actually changed in a way that are well concise for indigenous knowledge, or we will have to struggle the whole life with the structures that were invented from an European perspective, and we are in the struggle of trying to deconstruct what is there, but how successful could we really be in that engagement? If we want to do is to bring indigenous worldviews, indigenous tradition, indigenous practice, indigenous knowledge to be recognized. So I would like to share that question because maybe.
Well, I would like to just take a stab at it by saying that, you know, at the University of Saskatchewan, we've developed a master's program in land-based cohorts, which means that we take the education of our students into lands, into territories, in the language, with the people, and allowing those people to offer us a way to bring our courses to them, with them, and embed those together. And so land-based, as we started earlier talking about protocols of place, are important because you're really embedding it in place. Now, Saskatchewan is better served by going to many different land places, but you have to ask, in this place, where is the ceremonies, where are the traditions, where are the things that happen in this particular place, and how do we bring those things together and share those in ways that make it that we understand what's in that particular place on which we build the rest of it. So in a way, we must move to not just the square classroom, but more land-based education, ways to take it into communities, ways to engage communities. And through that, we'll find that more and more of our youth will want to engage in that process and will then begin a process like that for themselves.
My comment is not losing sight of the important fact. that the nature and the place we're born into is our university. It's not a building. The language of instruction is the ancient language that was given to us to explain that place over centuries. It's not the universities as structured, or even the K through 12 classrooms that are structured. That our traditions are going to be revitalized, they're going to be nourished, our language is going to be nourished, and either the education system brings that knowledge in a respectful way, or we'll create our own knowledge system schools. That we're not limited by any kind of colonial structure, any type of other people's view of education. We have our own, and that is an Aboriginal right that every Aboriginal child has a right to. We prove that in court time and time again, and our treaty rights are supplemental to that. So under our Aboriginal and treaty rights, we can create any kind of institutions we want just for ourselves. And we can then deal with institutional arrangements, like having a college of elders created by the elders, sustained by the elders, like the College of Physicians and the College of Lawyers, which are self-governing bodies. That's really where our Indigenous knowledge is. How that's integrated into the rest of the institutions of Canada is a matter of integrity and choice for the university and the faculty and the students and the community it serves. And if they don't want to do that, and if they feel they can't do that, then that gives us the option to do it ourselves in our own way. But in the end, it's still going to be our knowledge system being revitalized, our languages being revitalized, and all of the knowledge and ceremonial aspects of that will occur because it's our fundamental constitutional right and human rights. So I'm not worried about the painful adjustment that always comes, and I'm not worried about the fear that always comes with education, because I don't think fear is appropriate for education. If you don't have an education system that loves and cares for the students and for knowledge, you don't have an education system. And so that's sort of my response.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks again to all of our elders. I haven't met all of you, so my apologies if I've missed some of you. University of Winnipeg is very committed to indigenization. We are authentic in what we are trying to do. I got to speak to a group of Western University arts and science deans. I talked to them about Winnipeg. I talked to them about the University of Winnipeg. And one of the things that came out loud and clear is you have to do what works in your community. You have to work with your community. And how we approach it here might be a little different with how you approach it at the University of Saskatchewan, but we are committed to working with you and doing it right. And we are committed to, I'm thinking of you as a split head generation now, Kevin, because you walk in many complicated worlds. So again, thank you very, very much. One more round of applause to our speakers, to Jarita, to all of you.